B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, November 10th, 2020. Based on the oral arguments at the Supreme Court today, it appears that Obamacare will survive the latest attempts to kill it. That's good news for 20-plus million Americans who rely on the coverage they get from Obamacare. And as you know, I don't believe that Obamacare is perfect. I'm a Medicare for all guy. And unfortunately, heading into the Biden administration with the narrowly divided Senate and House, there's very little likelihood that if the court strikes it down, that a replacement could be legislatively agreed upon. So I think this is good news under the circumstances, and we will have to leave, like so many other things, health care to the future for any significant changes. But the oral arguments are fascinating, and it is the Chief Justice, once again, John Roberts, who provided the swing vote to uphold Obamacare originally. He was joined by newbie Brett Kavanaugh, and they both flatly just declared that the issue before them is whether, when the individual mandate and the so-called tax, the payment you had to make if you decided you're not going to buy health insurance, once that was removed by Congress, did it cause the entire law to collapse? And I've always felt that this was an expedient argument that had little merit. But because of the addition of Amy Coney Barrett to the court, and she did participate in the oral arguments today, we'll detail that for you in a moment. But I was concerned that the court would find some way, like it did in the Citizens United case, to essentially redefine the issues before the court to produce a foregone conclusion. So Kavanaugh, and this is surprising, he said it seems fairly clear that the proper remedy would be to sever the mandate provision and leave the rest of the law in place. So this is extremely encouraging because, as I mentioned, had the court, and you know, this action won't happen until late in the term, which is May or June, when they issue an actual decision. And often, the oral arguments are not this clear, where you really can tell how a justice is likely to vote. So the case before the court, California versus Texas, was brought by Republican officials who claimed that the mandate became unconstitutional after Congress in 2017 zeroed out the penalty for failing to obtain health insurance because it could no longer be justified as a tax. This Republican challenge, and this is after what? The House voted more than 60 times in an attempt by Republicans to repeal Obamacare, and the Senate a handful of times, including the critical vote when John McCain appeared late at night and gave it a thumbs down. So it started in Texas, where a Republican judge clearly just said that the entire law was invalid. Then it went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans. They agreed that the mandate was unconstitutional, but declined to rule on the fate of the rest of the law, asking a lower court to reconsider the issue. And then states controlled by Democrats and the House of Representatives intervened to defend the health law and asked the Supreme Court to get involved to remove the uncertainty over the law. So here's a quote from the chief, Robert, saying, "I think it's hard for you to argue that Congress intended the entire act to fall if the mandate were struck down, when the same Congress that lowered the penalty to zero did not even try to repeal the rest of the act. I think, frankly, that they," referring to the plaintiffs in this case, "wanted the court to do that. But," he said, "that's not our job." And even Sam Alito, who I have little respect for, He quizzed one of the lawyers in the oral arguments, and he said that in the first case there was a strong reason to believe the individual mandate was essential to keep the plane flying. Now the part has been taken out, but the plane has not crashed. How would we explain why the individual mandate in its present form is essential to the operation of the act? So he, too, appears to be leaning toward denying the case before the court. And here comes Neil Gorsuch, one of the Trump appointees who I suspected would be in favor of killing Obamacare, and in an exchange with the Solicitor General of Texas, Kyle Hawkins, who said that the mandate is no longer valid because it does not raise revenue for the government, and allowing the measure to stand would mean there are no limits to Congress's powers. Now, that's quite a leap, but that's what he said. Gorsuch seems skeptical about the injury to the states challenging the measure, asking who exactly they want me to enjoin and what they want the court to block them from doing. And Justice Sotomayor, said there's a problem with the argument by Texas about why it even has standing to challenge the law. She expressed skepticism that people were harmed when Congress zeroed out the penalty but kept the mandate in place. It requires one to assume that more people would buy coverage without the penalty than would buy coverage when it was in place. And she said you have to prove that a small number would include people who didn't enroll in Medicaid or CHIP when it was a legal requirement, but they would do so now after they're told there's no penalty for it. At some point, common sense seems to me would say, huh? And Amy Coney Barrett made her first, they didn't actually appear. This was a conference call, oral argument. But Amy Coney Barrett participated, and she questioned whether the mandate is constitutional now that the penalty is gone. Why couldn't we believe when Congress zeroed out the tax that it was no longer a tax because it generated no revenue? So she is still looking for a way. And she, of course, went public as a law professor at Notre Dame, crapping all over the Chief Justice for what truly was a strained interpretation to call the penalty a tax instead of a fee, and therefore Congress had the right to impose it. And even the usually silent Clarence Thomas popped up. He pressed Don Verrilli, who is the lawyer representing the House of Representatives. And back in 2012, Verrilli had argued that the law requiring Americans to buy coverage was crucial for the rest of it to work as intended. Now Verrilli is asking the court to uphold the rest of the law, even if it strikes down the mandate. So Thomas seemed to think that was inconsistent. When this case came up some years ago, this provision was the heart and soul of the ACA. I know the assessment has changed, but the provision hasn't changed, except for the penalty. So Verrilli said Congress asked the Congressional Budget Office what would happen if they zeroed out the tax. CBO came back and said the effect on the market would be the same either way. So, I find this quite a relief, and I did not expect it. I thought that they were going to do convoluted legal arguments and then backflips to find a way to kill Obamacare. So I think, again, I would like to see Medicare for all, a single-payer system. I'd like to cut the insurance companies' profit-taking out of the cost of health care. But it ain't going to happen anytime soon. Joe Biden plans to deliver a health care speech this afternoon to focus on the efforts to overturn the ACA. Biden made the fate of the ACA a central part of his campaign, and in his remarks, he plans to talk about the stakes for families across the country in the case and his plan to expand access to quality, affordable health care. Well, he'll be beating Trump to the punch. We still haven't seen a shred of detail about what Trump would replace Obamacare with had he succeeded, along with his Republican allies, in overturning it or finding a way to repeal it. In other news, I want to recommend the latest from Kevin Gosztola at Shadowproof. As the legal team for Julian Assange has submitted its closing argument in a legal brief to the judge in the extradition hearing in London, he is being sought, Assange is, by the United States to be brought here for trial. And it's fascinating to read it because it addresses the key elements of the conditions required for the judge to approve extradition under the British-U.S. treaty that governs extradition. And one of the clear carve-outs there is that Britain does not have to extradite somebody who's being sought for political reasons. And the brief, I think, does a great job of explaining the political nature of the demand for the head of Julian Assange. Gosztola writes, the closing argument relies on evidence presented by witnesses who testified during a trial in September, details how the Obama administration declined to prosecute Assange, and then the Trump administration reversed this principled position because of the nature of Assange's disclosures to the world and his political opinions, which inevitably attracted the hostility of the Trump administration and the CIA. All of the charges, just to be clear, relate to the period in 2010 when Chelsea Manning provided documents and videos to WikiLeaks. The case technically does not include anything related to the 2016 election. So Assange's defense refers to the political agenda of the Trump administration, their obvious hostility to Assange's exposure and condemnation of U.S. war crimes and human rights abuses. The prosecution has sought to distort the facts, the brief says, in order to present what is plainly a prosecution for political offenses into a prosecution for ordinary crimes. And it's interesting to note that I think Britain will be much more sympathetic to the efforts by the United States to evade any accountability for war crimes that occurred in Iraq and or Afghanistan. So the summary here by Gosztola is excellent, and I encourage you to read it so that you will understand the strong legal basis to deny extradition and the way that under Trump, people like Mike Pompeo, first at the CIA and then at the State Department, prosecuted, or let's say he advocated for the prosecution of Assange, and this was clearly political in its nature. Lawyers for Assange maintain the case coincided with the grant of diplomatic status by the Ecuadorian government. That grant was, of course, well known to the U.S. authorities because, well, they were able to listen in at the embassy where Assange had taken asylum. And they even, had improper access to legal documents and the legal conversations that Assange had with his legal team, his attorneys. So I think that, I find this a compelling brief. Vanessa Baraitser, the judge in the case, has clearly telegraphed repeatedly from the bench that she doesn't care, that she is there to rubber stamp the U.S. request, and for Britain to remain a lapdog to the U.S. on matters such as this. So she gets to read these briefs, and then January 4th is when she is supposed to announce her decision regarding the extradition of Assange. This one really stunned me today when I looked at the homepage of the New York Times and learned that the recent war that started on September 27th between Armenia and Azerbaijan is now over. And Armenia has accepted a big loss. 1,600 of its citizens, including many soldiers, have been killed by Azerbaijan during this, 6-week war. And Armenia has agreed bitterly to an agreement that was negotiated by Moscow which will include the deployment of peacekeeping forces in the contested enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. And if you haven't listened yet, go to October at peterbcollins.com. And there's a great interview with Terry Phillips, who is of Armenian descent. He's a globe-trotting reporter who has been to this area, and he gave us, I think, a good description of the tensions over Nagorno-Karabakh that have festered since the 1990s. And so it's to me, I tend to support Armenia, both in its long-term battles with the Ottoman Empire and now Turkey, and in this recent struggle with Azerbaijan. So here's a quote from Giragosian. Let's see, let me get who he is. He is the director of Regional Studies Center in Yerevan. He said, "There's a general sense in the streets that we had no choice. This was the best alternative to save what was left of Nagorno-Karabakh. The trauma of victimization has returned. There's a sense that the world and the West have abandoned us. And just based on news coverage alone and the lack of any commentary from American political officials, we did completely ignore this. And the election and Trump's tweets are no excuse. We, I think, have to be vigilant across the globe, and the U.S. needs to speak up and take positions. When these kinds of wars of aggression and territorial accretion break out." Here's another quote from Tatul Hakobian, an Armenian journalist who's covered the region for more than 30 years. "We lost the war, and this is the tragic reality which we should accept." And the deal involves the Russian peacekeepers for up to 5 years to keep the parties from re-engaging. It's almost 2,000 Russian troops and 90 armored personnel carriers, not characters, which will patrol the new border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And overnight, do you call it impeachment, or was it a coup? In Peru, the Congress has sworn in its leader, Manuel Merino. This followed an effort to impeach the current president, Martin Vizcarra. It failed back in September, but they tried again on Monday, and this happened amidst furious protests, clashes with police. Hundreds of demonstrators gathered again this morning in downtown Lima to protest the swearing-in of Manuel Merino, who they view as the key figure in orchestrating the ouster of Martin Vizcarra. A total of 105 out of the 130 lawmakers voted to remove Vizcarra last night. He's previously said, Vizcarra, that no fewer than 68 of the members of Congress seeking his impeachment are themselves subject to ongoing legal processes. And corruption has run deep in Peru historically. So, I'm not an expert on Peru. I don't know exactly what to make of this. So far, we don't see the hand of the United States, at least not visibly. And so that's how things go in certain parts of the world. Yesterday, some people were shocked that Trump tweeted the termination of Mark Esper as Secretary of Defense. Democrats have criticized the move, saying that, here's a quote from Congressman Adam Smith, chair of House Armed Services Committee. He's a Democrat from Washington State. "Dismissing politically appointed national security leaders during a transition is a destabilizing move that will only embolden our adversaries and put our country at greater risk. Trump's decision to fire Esper out of spite is not just childish, it's also reckless." Well, it is those things. And here's a quote from Tim Kaine. Remember, he ran for president with Hillary. He's a Democrat from Virginia. And he said, "In the last weeks of a lame duck presidency, firing Esper serves no purpose and only demonstrates an instability harmful to American national defense." Well, I take a kind of contrary view. I think this signals that Trump is not planning any grand military action. Whether he believes that he's going to somehow hold on to power, or whether he actually is starting to accept that he is a lame duck. And so, when we look a little deeper at this, Mark Esper knew it was coming, and he gave an interview to Military Times. We don't know exactly when, but he's trying to, write his epitaph. And so he said he was fired because he declined to bend the knee to Trump. And he warned of what's to come. I could have a fight over anything. I could make it a big fight. I could live with that, he said. But why? Who's going to come in behind me? It's going to be a real yes man. And then God help us. Well, Esper knew what he was getting into when Trump fired Mattis. Well, Mattis quit, and then Trump fired him for quitting, if you remember how that actually happened. But this is kind of like Melania, who told her rich friend from New York, I know the man I married. Well, Esper knew the man that he accepted the nomination to Secretary of Defense from. And Esper knew that it wouldn't last forever, but that it will line his pockets because he will be more valuable than ever to Raytheon or any other military contractor he decides to exit the revolving door into. And he did publicly challenge Trump over the use of the federal law that would allow troops to be deployed to quell an insurrection. He also defied Trump on trying to rename military bases with Confederate links. And he also stepped away from Trump back in January after we killed Soleimani and said that the United States would not be targeting Iranian cultural sites if we decided to bomb over there. So I don't want to dispute that Esper did occasionally try to assert himself. But he was compromised from the get-go, and he repeatedly did the dance where he would praise the bold leadership of President Trump. I want to thank President Trump for his leadership and support of this critical mission. Doesn't matter what the mission was. So I don't shed any tears for the departure of Mark Esper. And as I said, to me, this signals that there won't be an attack on Iran or on Venezuela before Trump presumably leaves office on January 20th. Also, I got a text from my buddy, retired newsman Dave Cook, just before I sat down to record the podcast today. He notes the mixed signals coming from Washington, where Secretary of State Pompeo stood outside the State Department this morning and proclaimed there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump term. Then the White House orders underlings to proceed with preparing Trump's February budget proposals. And Dave says if it sounds like an attempted coup and it looks like an attempted coup, well, he's concerned that these people are not planning to vacate. And this could be a problem. There's no doubt about it. Now, one of the other conflicting signals that has surfaced in the last 24 hours, and this could be just another grifter by the guy who calls himself a billionaire, but Trump has announced the formation of the Save America PAC. And maybe Steve Bannon will help him go fleece people who want to build their own sections of wall on the southern border. But he is directing the money raised through his campaign's request to defend the election, also shift into Save America, which is known as a leadership PAC. It's got a contribution limit of $5,000. It'll be used to underwrite Trump's post-presidential activities. Now, that frame is from the New York Times, not him. Tapping into the vast reservoir of small donors that made him a dominant fundraiser for a time in 2020. But it's likely to have a far greater significance for a man who's refusing not only to concede the election, but remains reluctant to surrender the spotlight. In that sense, his PAC could become a fan-subsidized machine to perpetuate his agenda and plot his next moves. Now, there's a rumor circulating in Washington that with the formation of this PAC, Trump has also floated the idea of running for president 4 years from now. And to entertain that idea means that he is accepting that he is not going to be president for the next 4 years. And I'm sorry if I'm confusing you, but it is confusing. And it's very hard to read. And the grifter part shows up in the fine print. So I have a friend who's on the Trump mailing list, and on Facebook he posted the demand letter. They're not being soft about this, that came from the Trump campaign demanding that he contribute to help defend the integrity of the election. But the original idea was that 60% of the money was going to pay off debts of the Trump campaign. Now it's shifted. 60% of donations are earmarked for this new PAC, Save America. And only after a donor gives more than $5,000 does any of the money go to the recount account that Trump has set up. And in addition, 40% of every donation goes to the Republican National Committee, whose coffers Trump has just raided repeatedly to pay for lawyers, for Don Jr. and Eric, related to impeachment and other things. So the number of Republican senators who have acknowledged the Biden victory has expanded, but only a little. Ben Sasse of Nebraska and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska have joined Romney of Utah and Collins of Maine. They are the only 4 Republicans who have acknowledged that Biden has beaten Trump. Boris Johnson, the wacky Prime Minister of Britain, he tweeted today, "I just spoke to Joe Biden to congratulate him on his election. I look forward to strengthening the partnership between our countries, working with him on our shared priorities of climate change and promoting democracy." And, he used the phrase, building back better. That amuses me because I think it's a really lame slogan. And on the floor of the Senate today, Democratic leader Schumer excoriated his Republican colleagues for not speaking out against Trump's unfounded claims of widespread election fraud and for not recognizing Biden as the legitimate winner. Quote, "The extent to which the Republican Party is delegitimizing the president's assault on our democracy is infuriating and deeply, deeply wrong. He is declaring himself to be the winner of an election that he lost. He is claiming to win states that he lost. His legal team is filing scores of frivolous, unsubstantiated lawsuits." Schumer accused McConnell and other Republicans of trying to give their president air cover as he makes a play to reverse the election results based on unsubstantiated claims. That's the kind of thing you hear about in banana republics, Schumer said. I've been telling you in recent weeks about how most progressives are unaware of how, on a daily basis, right-wing media demonizes us, not just for being on the other side, not just for honestly disagreeing about what's best for our nation, but for being defective human beings, toxic libtards. And here's an example of somebody who just blurted it all out. He is the now former police chief of a town that is north of Little Rock in Arkansas, Marshall, Arkansas. And over the weekend, after Biden was announced the winner, he went up on Parler, the right-wing equivalent of Facebook, and it should be parler, it's a French word for talk. And he said, "Will you and several hundred more go with me to D.C. fight our way into the Congress, arrest every Democrat who has participated in this coup, we may have to shoot and kill many of the communist BLM and Antifa Democrat foot soldiers to accomplish this. Death to all Marxist Democrats. Take no prisoners. Leave no survivors. Now, Lang Holland, that's his name, he is not the only right-wing nut who has been energized and enabled under Trump to act on the deep, dark, and ugly thoughts that course through what passes for a brain. And with polling now showing that 70% of Republicans feel that the election has been taken away from their dear leader, and of course they ignore that the rigging of the election occurred beforehand and it was unsuccessful. It was intended to make sure that Trump won. And we hear all these claims coming from Republicans. We'll run down a few of them in a moment about how this election's been stolen. These are the rip-off artists who were hoping to steal it from Biden. As I pointed out yesterday, the Democrats managed to exceed the margin of craft, to overcome the many barriers that were erected to block people, mostly Democrats, from voting this year. The lame efforts to stop the counting of ballots, that was a legitimate process. Well, now in Georgia, the two Republicans who face runoff for their respective U.S. Senate seats, David Perdue and the appointed incumbent Kelly Loeffler, they've decided the problem is Brad Raffensperger, and that is the preferred pronunciation of Greg Palast, who has done deep coverage of Georgia. And Raffensperger is the Republican Secretary of State. He purged a lot of people who hadn't actually moved, and Greg Palast called him out on it in the weeks before the election. He did his duty as a Republican to suppress as many votes as he could. But now Perdue and Loeffler want him to quit. They want him fired because they're complaining that the election in Georgia is an embarrassment because Trump is losing by 10,000 votes in a state that they thought was locked for Trump. And they do it in the name of election integrity. Quote from their statement, "We believe when there are failures, they need to be called out, even when it's in your own party." They didn't offer any specific allegations or elaborate on how they believed that Raffensperger had fallen short, except to accuse him of mismanagement and lack of transparency. "Honest elections are paramount to the foundation of our democracy," they said. "The Secretary of State has failed to deliver honest and transparent elections. He has failed the people of Georgia, and he should step down immediately." Raffensperger laughed it off. He said he's not going anywhere. And this is so stupid, to work the ref who's already partisan on your team in advance of the January 5th runoff elections. And they're doing it out of loyalty for Trump, who is clearly on his way out. It is stunning. So here's a rundown of what Rudy Giuliani and other allies of Trump like Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, who illegally accepted money from the Trump Foundation for her election campaign. Well, they've been just making shit up. And so yesterday, they went public, and this went viral. Almost 1 million people saw it within 12 hours, with a claim that the website Real Clear Politics had changed its call for Pennsylvania and withdrawn a declaration that Biden had won. The problem is that Real Clear Politics has, in fact, not called a winner in Pennsylvania so far. Its president and co-founder, Tom Bevan, said, "This is false. We never called Pennsylvania, and nothing has changed. So this is the kind of activity that we're seeing. And let me be clear that I have long advocated for integrity in our elections. Despite my desire to see Trump go, and to see Republicans in the minority in the Senate, if I saw evidence of actual misbehavior or law-breaking and that rose to the level of potentially overturning a result in a critical state, I would say so. But I've checked with Brad Friedman, with Greg Palast, and there are these isolated instances where we have claims that, I was told to put a date stamp on this ballot so it would make the cut. But we don't have any evidence of that. And so far, other than a claim I saw in right-wing media that a guy in a Ferrari drove up to the convention center in Detroit and dropped off 130,000 ballots that were all for Biden, I've seen that claim, but haven't seen anything to support it. Steve Bannon is still at it, and Facebook removed a network of pages affiliated with Bannon yesterday. There were 7 of them associated with the Stop the Steal hashtag. And Facebook said, we've removed several clusters of activity for using inauthentic behavior tactics to artificially boost how many people saw their content. That includes a group that was originally named Stop the Steal, which later became Gay Communists for Socialism. These people, they just never stop. Never. Twitter's getting more aggressive with Trump. They have labeled 38% of his tweets since last Tuesday. And the New York Times also debunks the claim that 138,000 votes in Michigan, which were initially awarded to Biden and then switched over to Trump, was some sort of fraudulent act. It was a clerical error in a county that hadn't updated its software. And the switch benefited Trump. Yet this is raised by his allies as corruption and irregularities in the election in Michigan. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast and who have been supporting me over the years. And I just want to take this opportunity, in case you didn't hear yesterday, that I'm planning to wind down the Daily News and Comment podcast before Thanksgiving. I have plans to do some interviews with some of my favorite guests from over the years, and those will be posted through November and possibly into December. And then I'm going to be posting or reposting some of my favorite interviews from the PBC archives. So the website at peterbcollins.com and all of the audio recordings will remain available. And I plan to highlight some of those older interviews for you. And as I leave, I'm also going to be recording interviews with some listeners. I talked to Faith Peoples today, the first time. But I also want to thank Jerry in Southeast Portland, various DiLorenzos, including Perry, who has been a subscriber for a while, Paul Goodman, Dick Atlee, Terry Paris, Cheryl Fleming, Mary Vaught. They've all been longtime subscribers, and many of you are following my suggestion to cancel your PayPal order so that I don't end up fleecing you. And any subscription revenues that come in after the 1st of December will all be refunded to the subscriber or donor. So thank you so much for your support over the years, and I just appreciate each and every one of you. So because of all these lawsuits that Trump has ordered filed, the New York Times reports that 2 big law firms that have banked some big money from Trump since he ran for president, including the big national law firm Jones Day. And Jones Day has billed Trump for over $20 million since 2015 on his various legal skirmishes. But many members of the firm are uncomfortable being ordered to file lawsuits that they think don't have any merit. And they actually appear to have a conscience for people who bill $500 an hour, and they fear that they are undermining the electoral process. And another firm called Porter Wright was ordered by Trump to file a suit in federal court in Pennsylvania against the Secretary of State and a number of county election boards, alleging irregularities without offering any evidence or defining what those irregularities are. And they appear to be cringing at the demands that they are receiving. I want to recommend a couple of op-eds today. David Sirota published at The Guardian. He echoes some of the concerns that I raised yesterday about Joe Biden, who is talking a little too much about working with Republicans. Now, I'm not opposed to bipartisanship. I'm not opposed to compromise. But compromising with Mitch McConnell and the Republicans means they get 100% of what they want. And that is unacceptable. And Sirota writes, "You must appreciate how we arrived at this moment. In this week's election, Trump kept the race close by winning 82% of voters who listed the economy as their top concern. He was able to do that amid an economic crisis because Democrats didn't forcefully articulate an economic message. Instead, Biden cast his candidacy in gauzy platitudes about restoring the country to a pre-Trump status quo. And so moving forward, the answer to Democrats asking, what do we do now, should be clear. A new Democratic White House must show it is using its power to deliver for the working class. It must avoid replicating what happened in the first few years of the Obama presidency." He said that similar to now, Obama won the White House on a wave of anger at an incumbent president. He took office under crisis conditions. Yet, despite the Democrats winning large congressional majorities, Obama administration used its power to merely tweak the economic status quo, but not really change it. Obama's administration also refused to prosecute bankers, and its Wall Street reform package was pathetically weak. Sirota's correct. When liberal groups floated the idea of pressuring incumbent Democrats to support more robust health care reforms, White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel berated them as effing retarded. As President, Biden will have the unimpeded executive authority to implement a number of administrative rules to reform the tax code, lower drug prices, reduce student debt, crack down on Wall Street, and raise wages. And Sirota suggests that in his first 100 days, he should introduce legislation that honors his campaign promises to boost the minimum wage, strengthen union protections, and impose a wealth tax on billionaires. Also, I want to recommend a piece by my old buddy John Nichols at The Nation. And he adds some election data to the pushback on John Kasich, who is blaming progressives for nearly costing Biden the election. And Kasich, who is reportedly being considered for a cabinet post in the Biden administration, claims, and this is a head-scratcher, the best thing that's happened to Biden is the fact that the United States Senate is either going to be Republican or very close, and the far left can push him as hard as they want. Frankly, the Democrats have to make it clear to the far left that they almost cost him this election. So did they? Well, John Kasich tried to deliver Ohio for Biden. He spoke at the convention. He's the former governor and congressman from Ohio. And Trump actually slightly increased his margin of victory in Ohio. From 2016, it was 8.1%, and this year it was 8.2%. And also, Nichols marshals the voter information to show that it's progressives who put Biden over the top. And so this sniping that comes from congressional moderates or corporate Democrats in the House is just preposterous. And as I said yesterday and before, They are asking the progressives to avoid creating anything that Republicans can lie about in the next campaign. And that is just preposterous. So here's another tweet from AOC. John Kasich, who did not deliver Ohio to Dems, is saying folks like Ilhan Omar, who did deliver Minnesota, are the problem. Please don't take these people seriously and go back to celebrating and building power. So let's put some numbers on that. Ilhan Omar was targeted by Trump, who basically said, we're going to win the state of Minnesota because of her. She's telling us how to run our country. How did you do where you came from? How's your country doing? Well, Omar's response was not to go on Twitter. She organized, and her team cranked up the vote in Hennepin County, that's Minneapolis, by 100,000 votes, including the margin for the Democrats from 63% in 2016 to 71% this year. And by cranking up turnout to 90%, her district contributed mightily to Biden's 52 to 45. That's a 7-point victory in Minnesota. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. When we look at the numbers today, global cases are closing in on 51 million, global deaths 1.2 million. U.S. confirmed cases, over 10 million now. U.S. total deaths at 238,000. New cases yesterday, 119,000 according to Johns Hopkins, 130,000 according to the New York Times. And the newly reported deaths yesterday, 472 from Johns Hopkins, 745, says the New York Times. And now, all 50 states report more new cases in the latest week than in the week before. 45 states had a higher rate of people testing positive than last week. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz plans to announce a new COVID-19 restriction set amid a surge in statewide infections, likely to include stricter rules for bars and restaurants. In Illinois, stricter restrictions will go into effect Wednesday. The governor is hinting at a stay-at-home order for Thanksgiving. In North Dakota, where hospitals are at full capacity, healthcare workers who've tested positive but are not showing symptoms are being allowed to continue to work. That's sad. Dozens of protesters outside of the governor's mansion in Utah opposed the Governor Gary Herbert order for a statewide mask mandate that went into effect. And in Colorado, the governor, Jared Polis, announced he has extended the mask mandate for another 30 days. So Alex Azar, who is, for now, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, predicted that there'll be enough vaccine for general public campaigns by spring of 2021. And I just want to caution you once again. The Pfizer study is encouraging. It is based on 94 patients. And while the president of Pfizer said that he didn't give orders to fast-track this to help Trump, can we really be confident that the studies are complete, they're thorough? Well, I'm not. And so all of this talk about distributing the vaccine, what we discussed yesterday, Whitney Webb's report on the military team with a military contractor operating as a buffer between Operation Warp Speed and the standard rules of the U.S. government, I think we have to be very careful. Azar has also touted the emergency use authorization by the FDA for Eli Lilly's monoclonal antibody bamlanivimab. What a stupid name. I'm in favor of making anything that works available, but it has to be tested, and we really need to be assured that there won't be side effects that were not properly studied. Brazilian health officials have suspended clinical trials of China's Sinovac coronavirus vaccine. That happened yesterday, following a severe adverse event involving a volunteer. They announced that the event occurred on October 29th, but we don't know what it is. One director said that a volunteer had died, but the death wasn't related to the vaccine trial. So we need more information, but that story broke yesterday. And a public health expert who Biden named to his coronavirus advisory board said Tuesday he's concerned about military plans to distribute a COVID-19 vaccine. We have to understand that Operation Warp Speed has been a remarkable effort in terms of bringing vaccines forward. But, says Michael Osterholm, this vaccine has to be kept at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't have refrigeration operations like that, and there have been very few resources provided to state and local health departments to go beyond the initial planning. So here is a potential vaccine that they're touting. But number one, it requires 2 doses, and number 2, it has to be stored at this deep, deep freeze temperature, or it'll spoil. And that creates challenges for shipping and storing and distribution. And I think that the horse has gotten well ahead of the cart here. Also, Linda did some investigation into some of the people named to the Biden coronavirus task force, including a woman named Luciana Borio, MD. She is heavily into biological terrorism. She's a vice president of In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital firm. It was mentioned in the Whitney Webb article that we referred to and quoted from yesterday. So she was National Security Council Director for Medical and Biodefense Preparedness under Trump, 2017 to 19, acting chief scientist at the FDA before that under Obama, and also assistant commissioner of FDA for counterterrorism policy under Obama. And during the Bush administration, she implemented and managed mathematical modeling projects at Health and Human Services. She was a senior fellow for global health for the Council on Foreign Relations, but is now listed as on leave. So she is a Washington creature with experience in many dark corners. And she's on the Biden task force. That doesn't enhance confidence, does it? So a new study based on cell phone data captured in the spring when coronavirus was growing across the United States identifies restaurants, gyms, cafes, and other crowded indoor venues as the source of 8 in 10 new coronavirus infections. I think it's interesting to see that airlines are not included in that list. So the public venues in low-income neighborhoods were hardest hit because those people can't go to work on Zoom. And finally, in the COVID file today from The Guardian, a troubling report from Britain. Researchers at the University of Oxford and the Oxford Health Biomedical Research Center find that 1 in 5, 20% of people who've had COVID-19 have now been diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder like anxiety, depression, insomnia, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's not clear if this is just the arduous or grueling process of going through it. But The Guardian introduces us to a British woman named Eleanor. She had no diagnosed mental health conditions before. Post-COVID, the situation's very different. She's seeing a therapist to help with post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety. She said the deterioration of her mental health was at least in part because her workplace and her general practitioner didn't take her symptoms seriously when she became ill at the end of March. I was told by my line manager that it couldn't be COVID because I didn't have a persistent cough. And as my symptoms worsened, I was told by the doctor that it was likely anxiety and that my lethargy could be explained as many found it hard to motivate themselves at this time. By week 8, she was still experiencing fever, and her GP, the doctor, now said it seemed likely that she had had COVID. So these are anecdotal reports, but it does seem to be based on a deeper study, and that is concerning. I want to credit Alan McLeod for breaking the news here in the U.S. I haven't seen it in any other media outlet, that after the mass attack in Vienna, Austria, the European Union is using that as a pretext to end encryption. They want backdoors to WhatsApp and Signal, and probably Apple iPhones. A European Council draft resolution reads, "The European Union fully supports the development, implementation, and use of strong encryption." Yeah, right. Encryption is a necessary means of protecting fundamental rights. At the same time, the European Union needs to ensure the ability of competent authorities to exercise their lawful powers, both online and offline. Just like 9/11, being used to rationalize the passage of the Patriot Act and impose a whole new regime of restrictions on Americans' rights, they're making the attempt in Europe based on 5 people dying in a shooting spree in Vienna. And Trump is continuing to deport people with legitimate claims of asylum, including a group of Cameroonian asylum seekers. There's been an effort to block a flight that is scheduled for today, which the asylum seekers have referred to as a death plane. Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland has appealed to Homeland Security to halt deportation flights to Cameroon while political violence is still widespread there. About 32 men and 4 women are scheduled to be on the flight today, and I don't have an update about whether the efforts to stop it were successful. And finally, I'm linking in the show file for today's podcast to an interesting opinion piece written by John Farmer and published at The Hill. And he takes up Joe Biden's call for unity and an end to looking through each other. But Farmer notes, cable news brought with it an abandonment of the principle underlying broadcast news, that news is a public service, subject to a requirement of equal time or fairness, and essentially a loss leader, not a profit center for media. With the advent of cable news, the so-called fairness doctrine was deemed obsolete. Well, in fact, the real fact is that there is no regulation of cable news. None. The Communications Act of 1934 only affects stations that are licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. Anyway, applying niche marketing principles to the American electorate, the cable news channels have carved up their public to shape their audiences. They thrive on the intensity of our divisions. Social media have taken those niche marketing principles and converted them to consumer surveillance algorithms that drive revenues. Indeed, application of those algorithms is the essence of the social media business model. Applied to consumer choices, the reinforcement of predilections accomplished by commercial surveillance is effective in driving spending. Otherwise, the companies wouldn't engage in it. Applied to politics, however, commercial surveillance acts as a centrifuge, driving every discussion away from consensus, steering people into cul-de-sacs of their own biases, making them ultimately unrecognizable to each other. So he makes a lot of good points in this piece and argues that the Communications Act of 1934 should be revised. And yeah, I mean, we're almost at its 100th birthday. And technology has changed a whole hell of a lot since 1934. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. All the way to the very end here. You're free to share it with anybody. You can find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to